The truth matters. Today we heard some stories from the sacred scriptures that narrate a moment of cultural expression within a particular imperial colonial framework. First, we heard Psalm 1 with a theme of happiness through obedience and its outcomes. Next, we listened to the story of the Israelites under the Egyptian Empire. And then we heard a story of the early Lucan movement under the Roman Empire. All three literary readings are cultural expressions from three different watershed ancient moments that call attention to the socio-historical forces against equality. In today's theological reflection, I will bring to bear my thoughts upon these two latter readings. The Exodus narrative prepares readers for the story of the Israelites' times as slaves under Egyptian rule. It takes on Genesis' ancestral theme and carries it forward throughout the book of Exodus, situating the ancestors within a story of enslavement, deliverance, and exile. And it's a story that speaks to the Israelites' relationship with God under challenging times, which might be why it resonates for many oppressed groups across time and space. For the modern period, it remains a powerful story, used by many to legitimate a settler colony, enslave others, annihilate peoples, and expand westward to conquer communities and their lands, as historian Greg Grandin documents well in The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. And at the same time, a story used by many to liberate people's both bodies and minds, as it did for many abolitionists and slaves, like it did for Frederick Douglass. This story of Israel's bondage in Egypt, although it can inspire liberation movements, begins as a story of fear and resentment. We know that a new king came to power in Egypt. The king became afraid that the Israelites were increasing and receiving the same rights and privileges as the Egyptians received. So the king, to put the Israelites in their cultural hierarchical bottom place, decides to punish them, lest the Israelites will increase in population with others and escape. But the more the Israelites called for their recognition and continued to grow in numbers, the more the Egyptians were resentful and oppressed the Israelites. Taking drastic measures, the king attempts, using women or midwives, to kill the firstborn son of each Israelite family. This story is an example of a politics of resentment, as Francis Fukuyama speaks about in a volume entitled Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. And this is a fear story, and a fear story used by many to create division. Have you not heard the dog whistles from certain people and media outlets that the ethnic, racial minoritized, the gender and sexualized minoritized, or religious and non-Christian communities are getting too powerful and want to take us over? The powerful say that the minorities do not belong. In fact, they are just here visiting. So let's remove their books, erase their histories, cut their arts programs, threaten and inflict violence upon them. Let's tell them how to control their bodies and minds and what names they should use, to list a few examples. Now, the details might be different from the Exodus story, but the message is the same. Let us create fear and let's subordinate them so the powerful can maintain their power and continue to rise. This sounds like the thoughts of the character, the king of Egypt. And with Luke, we heard what is normally titled the Sermon on the Plain, the Beatitudes, with special attention to explain why the privileged are not suitable and explain why the lowly are preferred. These poles are brought together in this narrative and in other places in the Gospel of Luke. The rhetorical context in this story is one of teaching, and it appears that what is being asked here is whether the new disciples are ready to receive the call to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And do they know what that means? A question that many new students today might be asking, as well as many of us continue to ask. The element of fear is here too, but for the privileged. For the less privileged, the author points to the future of their rewards, which honestly is one of those strands, eschatological strands, that is problematic for me. In fact, I would point to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who argued against waiting for change in his letter from a Birmingham jail. For sure, Luke is very concerned for the poor and the outcast, and this I can resonate with. And like the story we heard from Exodus, Luke calls attention to the signs of his respective time. And identical to good literature, both readings call our attention to the signs of the time today through its binary realities. Both Exodus and Luke have some things in common. They are both calling out inequality. Theologically speaking, I'm not trying to link the two by way of one text speaking to another, nor when one text points to another. Rather, I'm focusing on what they have in common in their rhetorical and ideological aims, because both texts work from a particular framework, that is, the imperial colonial framework. Both stories speak to the representations of the socioeconomic conditions of the day. They tell the narratives of those oppressed or marginalized. Given the strong attack on education, libraries, and marginalized communities, these texts are shouting to pay attention to context, for the truth matters. Pay attention to those who have been and continue to suffer from the effects of long-term racism, long-term gender and sexual oppression, long-term attack on the disabled, and the long-term attack on the poor and the environment, to name a few. My friends, the truth matters. And there are movements out there trying to say otherwise by rewriting history or writing you out of history. These movements are trying to get you to forget about the oppression of the Israelites and trying to get you to forget about the history of poverty and slavery that existed in the compositional and literary history of these sacred texts. As we begin this new year, I want you to keep this in mind: the truth matters. What do I mean by this? Whatever sources you read or hear to get your news, and whatever experience you may personally have, at the end, the truth matters. Both these texts suggest that the truth matters. You can't understand the history of the borderlands, the history of slavery, the history of gender and sexuality formations, and the history of poverty without understanding the social, historical context behind texts of all sorts. This is why we need to continue with the fight to present all narratives of history. Over the summer, in my reading what was happening across the globe with drownings in the Mediterranean or the dishonest transportation of migrants to other cities, we have witnessed a strong attempt by some powerful and privileged people to remove the truth from our histories. Whether it pertains to AP African American history and the rewriting of or the erasure of the experience of slavery, whether it pertains to the AP Psychology and the rewriting of or the erasure of gender and sexuality formations, whether it pertains to the writings of or the erasure of immigration history, please remember, the truth matters. As President Malott has said in various venues, the world is on fire. And I can't agree with him more on his reading of society. In addition, as Heather McGhee states in The Sum of Us, what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together, this rewriting of or erasure of history is an attempt by some to maintain their power, privilege, and wealth so they can buy their belonging and status. Is this not what the king of Egypt is trying to do? I might add, is not the king trying to buy his freedom? A myopic notion of freedom, that is, that allows him to oppress and exclude, as Ibram X. Kendi also speaks to in Stamped from the Beginning in narrating what the enslavers were trying to do with the notion of freedom. The story of oppression, the abusive use of power, the harmful use of women to do the dirty work of those in power, the violent oppression of many, black and brown today, sound eerily like our own socio-historical context. Of course, the two narratives, then and now, were written years apart, but their attention to a dire aspect of power does not seem far apart. In the story of Exodus, the experience of the Israelites is one of slavery. It is a social custom whereby a person is allowed to maintain ownership rights over another. And this custom was common and an accepted reality in the ancient world of the Israelites, and even in the first century by the Roman Empire, as Jennifer Glancy skillfully documents in Slavery in Early Christianity. And as modern readers, we have read about the derivatives of our nation's embrace of the institution of slavery from colonial times until the mid-19th century. As students of the ancient world, it is good to do a comparison between the institution of slavery then and now, and one will find similar themes such as racialization, debt repayment, policing, reparations, detention, splitting up of families, the use of laborers for work on plantations, and the buildings of religious sites. I might add here, you cannot understand immigration history and policies today without understanding the institution of slavery. Nor can you understand anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim rhetoric and violent behavior toward them or other non-Christian groups without understanding the history of slavery and vice versa. Again, vitriolic stereotypes, exclusion, detention, separation of families, and death are all similar patterns, reflecting how enslavers treated Africans in the modern period. 99 years ago, next year will be 100, in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which limited the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans to the U.S. This is the first comprehensive immigration act and it reaffirmed the narrative of who belongs and who does not belong. In fact, it participates in the meaning, in the construction of what white means, black means, and brown means, as Natalia Molina details in How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts. My friends, this is why truth matters. If we allow a few to disparage the fruits of critical race theory approaches in reading history and race, we will be left with one interpretation by those in power. Ancient authors, including the gospel writers and Paul, accepted slavery as the norm, and this is why we read these texts and histories as engaged readers in the classroom. We do find glimpses in the text where institutional slavery is condemned, but for the most part, you need to keep in mind that as democracy and capitalism are seen as the norm in this country, as a given for the most part, slavery as an institution controlled the political world and economics, as we have seen, as was seen as a norm, as a given. Imagine interpreting the Constitution without understanding that slavery played a role in its writing, as some originalists continue to do. My friends, this is why the truth matters. We must read critically our past and our present. Again, in Heather McGee's volume, The Sum of All, she argues that a primary reason why there is so much resentment by a certain segment of white society is because they believe that those who are not like them are profiting or benefiting the life things at their expense. As a result, border walls, physically and metaphorically, were and continue to be established to keep the minoritized out. The irony is that whites, that is, those who espouse consciously or unconsciously white superiority, are also oppressing whites themselves. McGee takes the Cyril Zum paradigm and runs it through various situations and stories, such as the development of private pools and communities, the purchasing of homes, loan and mortgage exclusion, the erasure of unions, the elimination of public education, to name a few. She does touch on the role of Christianity in slavery, but it really could use more development, an entire chapter, if you want my friendly opinion. But perhaps she is leaving that up to us. For the church could really use a serious and deep examination of how the church and Christianity plays a role in the zero-sum paradigm, for the truth matters. In the classroom, I like to share with students that people do bring their ways of seeing history, politics, and racialization, for instance, into their sacred spaces, congregations or parishes, for example, even into denominations. As much as they say they don't, they do. Christianity wonders why the number of Christians in the global north has declined. But I do wonder if part of it has to do with Christianity's failure to examine deeply how they participate in this zero-sum paradigm that McGee speaks to. This will be a good question to reflect on critically in religious studies classes in churches or in the classroom. We avoid or do just surface racial work on Christianity's participation or complicity with whiteness. We forget to mention that many of the KKK meetings, as Robert P. Jones in White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity speaks about, which were held in Christian churches with ministers as members of the KKK. We forget to mention that many Christian theological schools, Catholic and Protestant, are steeped in whiteness for many years with exclusion of the minoritized in many forms. We forget to mention that it was Christian ministers who preached eugenics, the false biological science that propelled nativism in this country. We avoid hearing that the true ruthless slave traders who profited immensely from slavery in the 1820s and the 1830s were Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, both Christians. We avoid talking about how slaves were the ones who built churches and religious academic institutions such as Georgetown University. And in theological education, we forget to mention that the classical theologians, biblical scholars, psychologists we read about and use as sources in our scholarships are also steeped in whiteness. You see, Christianity and theology is like a paintbrush dipped in white paint. And when it comes out and washed, one still sees lines of white paint on the brush. And if left overnight and not clean, it stiffens. And then it's hard to remove any leftover paint. We must keep working on Christianity immediately to remove the streaks left of its whiteness history, theology, ethics, biblical interpretation, and counseling. This is the task of theological education in the 21st century. It bears repeating. This is the task of theological education in the 21st century. For the truth matters. The story of Exodus calls to mind the present and our participation in the zero-sum game. Luke does the same thing. Luke's attention to the economy of privileges and disadvantages is strongly outlined in his sermon. It calls attention through the narrative, the colonial social context, along with socio-historical poverty, such as famine and grief. Luke also points to dislocation and unrest in the first century, especially among the poor. Such unrest led to resistance, reform movements, and violence during this period. Again, like Exodus, Luke is also reflecting through the narrative of social stratification that resembles the human condition of oppression today. This is the power of narrative, for the truth matters. And if we remain the status quo position of allowing a few to speak for the whole, oppression will be the resultant effect. In fact, I would argue it is already happening for many vulnerable communities here and across the globe. The truth matters because we all benefit from the truth. When we take classes on racism, we all benefit. When we take classes on Appalachian ministry, we all benefit. When we take classes on gender and sexuality, we all benefit. When we take classes on ecological studies or disability studies, we all benefit. And when we take classes on family and mental health, we all benefit. The truth matters because we all participate in what it means to be church, a community, a nation, and a school. Now, yes, this is a utopian message. It is easier said than done, but we must aim for it. Luke might be utopian in his message, but I would argue that Luke has sown the seeds to find ways to bring this utopian world to the present. These new seeds are visible in society among theologians, ministers, policy makers, artists, judges, counselors, and social activists. These are some of the new prophets of the day, serving the public through the church, for the truth matters. As we begin this new year and as we go down to the river to pray, I call on you to keep fighting, striving for the truth. We can't allow the forces of resentment to cut out our stories. We can't let them tell us that no one existed in the lands we stand on or out west. We can't let them tell us that slaves learned skills through slavery. We can't let them tell us that the transgender people are not humans. We cannot let them tell us that migrants are illegal. We can't let them tell us that climate change is not real. And we can't let them tell us that liberal, progressive theological education is not needed. We must control our narratives, for the truth matters.